Yes, good morning, everyone. We have food on the screen up here, right? So I don't know if this will make you hungry or not, but do appreciate everyone being here for class this morning. So this is where we left off last week. We were just getting ready to really talk about the Passover. And well, before we get started this morning, if you will, please pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning. We're so thankful for this day you've given us. We're thankful for your word that we can study and learn from, Father. We ask that you would always lead and guide us in our study so that we can learn and know the truth from you, the true source of all truth, Father, and wisdom. And we ask that you would fill us with your wisdom and your love so that we can be lights for you in this world, and so that we can carry out your plan for the things that are supposed to happen here in this world, Father, and that we would live the life that you've created us to live and be the Christians you want us to be, Father. In Jesus' name, amen. So, this is where we left off last week. We were getting ready to talk about the Passover. Now, this is a little bit more of probably a modern idea of the Passover, but I still thought it was a decent representation. If you look in the middle, we have the unleavened bread, and they have the little green thing. And then they have a lot more foods than maybe we know of from the Bible, but still, some of these things we would know about. And I'll mention some of these things, like first of all, the meat they would have back in the past, it would have been a lamb, like a sheep or a goat, lamb. In the modern day, some of them have taken to using chicken for whatever reason. Maybe it's just more convenient. I'm not sure about that. There are bitter herbs, which represent the bitterness of slavery. Nowadays they include a roasted egg, which is supposed to represent like the cycle of life, the sanctity of the firstborn, and the sacrifice of the firstborn. That's not something that you'll find in the Bible, but I do just want to mention that. The caroset, sweet paste made from nuts and fruit and wine, and it's supposed to represent the sweetness of redemption or deliverance. You know, God was delivering them from Egypt. And then the green vegetable dipped in salt water to recall the tears of their slavery. So, now this is all described in Exodus chapter 12. If you look in verse 8, and we're gonna look at that. I think we'll eventually get there. But just to read a portion of that from verse 8, then they shall eat the flesh of this lamb on that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. So that's the main gist of what we read there in Exodus. And Exodus that's the real Passover when it first occurred, when they were first preparing to leave Egypt, as you remember. Obviously, they've done some different things. Some little traditions have changed. Originally, they were to eat it standing, ready to go. But even in Jesus' day, we see that they're actually reclining at table when they ate it. So over time, that had changed just because they weren't really leaving Egypt anymore. Instead, they were doing it as a memorial. So nothing wrong with that. That's just the way that occurred. So if we look at our verses here in Matthew chapter 26, verses 17 through 19. Now on the first day of the feast of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover." Now, Matthew is actually kind of short, kind of a summary here. But I do want to notice one thing before we move past this. In verse 17, it says, "Now on the first day of the feast of the unleavened bread." I talked about this a little bit last week. Technically, that's incorrect. Technically, this is the day of the Passover. And the Passover was one day, and then the feast of the unleavened bread was the next day for 7 days afterward. So, and what I'm saying is this was the way they spoke about it. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that technically, when we look back in the Old Testament, we're going to see that the Passover is one day, and then the Feast of the Unleavened Bread starts the next day and runs for a week. And they got used to just referring to the whole thing as either the Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we're going to see that also in Mark and Luke. And I just want to point that out because this is just the way they spoke about it, much like we spoke about, and I think we mentioned this last week, the way we talk about the holiday season, which involves multiple holidays, right? Of course, they're not all crammed together like this, and that made this even more convenient for them because they are one right after the other. All right, so let's look at Mark's version. Mark chapter 14, verses 12 through 16. Now on the first day of unleavened bread. Now he says it even a little differently. He doesn't even call it a feast, but he says on the first day of unleavened bread, which at the Passover they did have unleavened bread, so it's not totally inaccurate, but it's just the way they talked about it. Anyway, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb, again, that was done on Passover, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?" And he sent out two of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him." Let's see, did I? No, okay. Wherever he goes in, say to the master of the house, "The teacher says, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples?" Then he will show you a large upper room, furnished and prepared. There make ready for us. So his disciples went out and came into the city and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. So who did they ask where to do the Passover at? They asked Jesus, right? He's the master, right? I mean, they say teacher here. Teacher, that word also can mean master. So he's their master, right? He's the one that they're following. So, and this is an example of when the Lord tells us what to do, when we know what he wants us to do, that's what we should do, right? When he has told us what to do, we should do that. They followed Jesus hearing this. Now, I don't know about you. I would have probably asked more questions because this sounds like a little bit of vague instructions, and I don't like vague instructions. I would want to know more details, but they followed what he said in faith. They followed his directions, even if that sounds kind of goofy to us. And how did they find things? Well, they found them just the way he said they would be, right? So when we follow Jesus, we will get the results he tells us to expect. And this is just like a little mini thing out of this, what we can take out of this. But we get both, as we know from the Gospels, we get both blessings and persecutions, but with the persecutions always comes deliverance. Nonetheless, let's look at Luke. If we look at Luke's version, chapter 22, verses 7 through 13. Now Luke, let's see. Luke has a little more here. Let's see, it's going to take, So, okay. So Luke 22, chapter 22, verses 7 through 13. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. Now again, he's calling this a little differently, the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. But the Passover lamb was killed on Passover. So just I want to keep making this point, because it reads one way to us because we didn't understand. I'll tell you, I used to be very confused over this because we would talk about a Passover and a Passover week and all that stuff. And we do that in general, we do. But in the Bible, the Passover is that one day, that one event. So that used to confuse me a lot when I was younger, and I didn't really understand that actually these two things, I didn't even know what the Feast of Unleavened Bread was really about, except you weren't eating unleavened bread. And I didn't realize that they were right together, so that it ends up being this one big thing. So that's why I'm going in repeating this so much, just to make sure that no one else is confused like I used to be, because it was confusing to me. Anyway, Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat. So they said to him, Where do you want us to prepare? And he said to them, Behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house which he enters. Actually, let's stop here for a second. So, who are the two that Jesus sent? Peter and John. So, when we look at verse 10, some people, when I was reading about this and studying some different things, they made a big deal out of this man carrying a pitcher of water. They seem to think that exclusively only women carried water, but I would say that would vary from house to house and from family to family and the conditions and what was going on, because you never know when you might have a house where the wife has died. There's only men, so somebody's got to go get that water, and they can't just wait for her to resurrect and go get it, right? So I'm not sure how important that is. Some people made a big deal out of that. But I think Jesus was just telling them who was going to meet them, who to look for, that type of thing. I don't think it was that big a deal. Also, this man, as it turns out, as we'll see in the next verses, he's a servant. And of course, any servant can be called to do anything that you need in your household. So I don't think that's a big deal, but some did make a big deal out of that. So just wanted to mention that. Let's see. Let's look at our next verses now. So verses 11 through 13. Then you shall say to the master of the house, the teacher says to you, Where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Then he will show you a large furnished upper room. There make ready. So they went and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. So don't see anything really unusual about any of this, that they followed this guy in. However, I was kind of thinking about this in a different way. Now, Peter and John did what Jesus said. They followed what he said, and they found it just the way he mentioned it. Again, that's one lesson we can take away from this, is just that when the Lord is telling us stuff, that it's going to be the way he says. Here in Matthew, there's mention of a certain man. Are we ever told who this man is? Not to my knowledge. I never hear a name for this fellow or anything. So what are the main things that they tell this man when they go in and see him, the actual master of the house? They tell him that the teacher says. Now this implies that he knows Jesus, the teacher or the master. He knows who they're talking about, because he didn't say, tell them Jesus of Nazareth says this, but the teacher. So this guy knew who Jesus was. And he says, my time is at hand. Now, I don't know how much we know that they did not like the idea that Jesus was going to his death. So I don't know how much this man may have understood that, but my time is at hand was another one of the things that Jesus told them. And then, I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. So those were the three things, and the Gospels really seem to all be in agreement on these major points, the main things here. So we want to think about what day of the week was this. Well, this was Thursday. This is Thursday. It is the 14th of that month, and their month is, I'll have it on a slide. It's like Nisan or something like that. I don't know how they pronounce it. It looks almost like Nissan, but it's not Nissan, but it looks similar. So, but anyway, it's the 14th of the month. It's Thursday, and at this point, before the evening, they're in that preparation mode. They're preparing for the Passover, and when the sun goes down, they will have the Passover meal. So here, they're preparing for that. Now, all of this with this man and arranging where to have the Passover, do you think this is the Lord's supernatural power, or did Jesus arrange this ahead of time? It's just a thought. It's just an open question.
I doubt if he did, but he could have, since the man was
Could go either way, couldn't it? It could go either way. I know. It really could. Jesus could have arranged this ahead of time and just not told the disciples, and there's a reason for that. But this could also be something that he done divinely some way as well. So I in the past, I looked at it as more of a divine thing, but now I look at it and I kind of think, well, maybe he arranged this ahead of time and he had good reason to do that. But it does sound like the man did know Jesus, so that would make sense if he arranged this ahead of time. And it's not 100% certain that he was expecting them for the Passover, but they did make sure to tell him that I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. So whether or not that was a reminder or new information, we don't really know. So just looking at it and how much of that is the power of the Lord versus him arranging it ahead of time, it's hard to say. But now, why might Jesus arrange this ahead of time and keep it a secret or not tell the disciples ahead of time? Well, he knows that Judas is going to betray him. He knows that Judas is looking for an opportunity to betray him. And he knows if he tells the disciples, Judas will know. He doesn't want, there's two factors here. One, he knows it's not quite his time in God's plan. It's close. He's only hours away, but it's not quite time. He doesn't want Judas and the priests and the temple guards interrupting their Passover and interrupting that evening he's going to have with the disciples, which when we go through John, you'll really see a lot of detail and a lot of what he talks about with the disciples that evening. And then he doesn't want that to be interrupted. He wants to have that time with them and to teach them, and he wants to establish communion, which if they were allowed to come in and interrupt all that, he may or may not have the time to do that. So there's several reasons why he would keep that a secret until like at this moment here. So to me, it sounds like Jesus arranged it ahead of time, in secret, possibly through his divine power, though, can't ignore that. But so the religious leaders and Judas would not be able to interfere with it. All right, so let's see, we talked about that. Sorry, I rambled. But so the apostles, they obeyed him in all of this. They obeyed him in faith. And again, this was not his time. Let's see. Now we may not think about it this way, but Jesus is actually in control of this situation. He's in control of when he's going to be arrested, when he's going to go to the cross, all of that. Because he has the power. And so he is following God's plan, and he's controlling the situation, and he's following that plan so that everything happens when it should happen. That may be hard for us to see and understand sometimes, but that's what's happening. That's what we're seeing. Each step of this, he's doing this the way it's supposed to be done, so things will happen at the right time. Now, looking at the Passover again in a way, just so we understand, who bought and got things ready for them to have the meal? It's the same two guys, right? Peter and John. So Peter and John are the guys that are doing that. Jesus sent them ahead earlier. I just didn't want us to forget that. There was just normal earthly things that had to be done to prepare for that Passover meal. They went and bought what they needed for that. There were vendors to buy certain things like the herbs and all those things from. My understanding is they would have to find or purchase a lamb from somebody unless they were bringing lambs around with them, which that's not my understanding that they were doing that. So they would have to get one, and then they would take it to the temple, and the priests would basically sacrifice it. Blood would be put on the altar, all that type of thing. And then the lamb would be taken and roasted whole without the blood, of course, because they weren't to eat the blood. So since there were 13 men, basically, at the Last Supper sharing this lamb, I would think most likely they probably ate all of it. But if they didn't, they would burn the leftovers so that they would not be there the next morning, right? So that whatever they didn't eat, they would burn. And that's what the law tells them to do. And we'll look at that too. But so if we continue looking at that, what animal can the lamb be? Well, it can be a sheep or a goat, right? Sorry, I was going for the animal, but you're right. What other characteristics must the lamb have? It must be unspotted or without blemish. It has to be a year old, and it has to be male. So if we look here, eventually I was going to bring us here to Exodus chapter 12, verses 8 through 11. If we look here, this is the original Passover when they were still in Egypt and they were being told how to do the Passover so that they would be delivered and come out of Egypt without their firstborn dying. So Exodus chapter 12, verses 8 through 11, then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. The idea was they needed to be ready to move out. They were going to leave Egypt in a hurry, if you remember this. So that's why they were like, it was something to be eaten quickly with your staff, with your shoes. You were ready to move. You had your belt, right? Your belt on your waist, so that things are what they call girded up and all that. So you were ready to go. So if we look at this, what has to be done to the lamb in verses 8 and 9? It has to be roasted whole, right? And if they don't eat it all, what do? They burn the leftovers, right? We don't get to put it in Tupperware and keep it for tomorrow or anything like that. So that's the same thing that Jesus and the apostles would have done. They would have burned anything that was left over. And of course, they're to eat the meal in haste. They must be ready to move out. But we see when Jesus and them have the meal, they do, the custom or the tradition has changed a little, and they do recline at table because they're not actually, I think I said this earlier, they're not actually in Egypt. So, all right. Okay, and then our communion should also remind us that the Lord has prepared us to work for him. He's delivered us and prepared us. And when we take communion, it should also be with kind of this idea that we should be ready to serve and follow the Lord and work for him as we have opportunity. There's some of that's connected. There's multiple reasons why Jesus connected the communion with the Passover, but that's one. So sometimes we may even have to create an opportunity, but we need to be working for the Lord. So if we look at Leviticus goes over these feasts, and this gets back to what I was talking about earlier. Leviticus chapter 23, verses 4 and 6, it talks about these two special feasts, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. These are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. These convocations are assemblies. They're assemblies, they're special assemblies and meals. It's why it's called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. So there we're going, like I said before, the Passover's on the 14th. And the next day starts the Feast of Unleavened Bread for the next week. And they just started talking about these things as if they're one event because, in essence, for us, the way we look at things, it is one long event in a way. So we have those two special days on the 14th and the 15th. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread actually goes 7 days. But this whole time, these whole 8 days are considered very special, very holy. And we tend to call it Passover week ourselves, but it's actually like 8 days total. If we look at the next verses here in Leviticus, On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. This is an assembly of people gathering together to celebrate this and to have this feast. But you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord for 7 days. The seventh day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. So both the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the last day are considered holy and are treated kind of like Sabbaths. And every day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they're offering a special offering by fire. So I don't think this is anything new to anybody, but just so we realize that's what's going on. You have the Passover, and then starting the next day, you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and that goes for a week. And you have these two special assemblies or convocations, the first and last day of that. So, let's see. All right, so the only thing they eat then is the unleavened bread. And this is where I was talking about the name of their month is Nisan, or however you would say that. But the 14th of the month, that's the Passover. And then the 15th through the 21st is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, in this case, in Jesus' time here, where he has the Passover, he's having the Passover on Thursday. The next day is Friday. Well, Friday evening begins the Sabbath regularly. And now the Feast of Unleavened Bread was also fallen on this Sabbath. That did not happen every year, but it's happening this year. So that made that Sabbath like a high holy Sabbath. It was even more special. Just to mention that. So, again, I just want us to realize these are two things and how they go together and how they referred to them and how they celebrated them. This might be too much information about this, but I think it helps us to understand. So they would refer to the whole 8 days as the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or maybe they would just call it unleavened bread or Passover. They would refer to those whole 8 days as all of that. Now, here's why that matters. Because some people think there's a discrepancy in the way it's mentioned in John. And they think that Jesus ate the Passover a day early, which is just not allowed. And Jesus did not do anything that was not allowed. That was just not a possibility. So we know he did everything perfectly. But here's where they get this kind of idea. This is early Friday morning. They've already arrested Jesus. They led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Now, again, this is the morning Jesus is being taken to Pilate. It's early Friday morning. So what we're looking at here is John just referred to this as the Passover. There's nothing really wrong with that. I mean, this is still technically by their, you know how they do things, evening and morning is the day. So technically, this is the morning of the Passover. He's not totally wrong. And in the evening, they're going to have that Feast of Unleavened Bread. They're going to have that special holy convocation, that assembly. And they're going to have a feast then. So these guys don't want to be defiled by going into this Gentile space for that. They want to remain by their standards clean so that they can attend and celebrate this Feast of Unleavened Bread, which again, he's just referring to it all as Passover. That doesn't really mean anything wrong or bad. It doesn't mean that Jesus ate the Passover a day early or anything like that. So I just wanted to mention that because that was a discrepancy that people thought they had. And these guys being the leaders, you got to think about this. These are the Jewish leaders. They don't want to be missing out on a special celebration or feast like that. That might look bad on them for a number of different reasons. It would be pretty unacceptable. So they didn't want to miss the first day, that special high holy Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So, all right. Now, if we come back to our verses here, and really there's just, the Gospels really all agree on what occurred here and how this happened. I do want to mention, let's see, right, okay, so it's kind of interesting to note that Jesus, he dies on the Passover day. That evening, it's going to change over and it's going to be the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But he dies on the Passover day, not... He has a Passover meal that night. That's the first of the Passover. And then the next day, during the day, like around 3 p.m., if I remember correctly, he dies. He dies before that Feast of Unleavened Bread. And there's a certain symbology there. He takes away everybody's sin on the cross before they have this week where they emulate not having sin. Before that starts. To me, that just has a kind of symbology to it, that he takes away our sin and this feast and this emulation, this symbology of doing that does not. You know, that doesn't really take away their sin. Anyway, to me, that kind of resonated, and maybe I'm not saying it the best. Maybe there's a better way to talk about that, but he did that before their feast even began. So again, if you hear anybody, if you hear about this discrepancy or anything, there's really not a discrepancy. Jesus did not have the Passover early, and he did not celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread, whereas they kind of make it sound like he did in a way, but that's just because of the way they spoke about it. All right, is there anything else on these verses? I originally thought these would be kind of blow-through verses, but then as I looked into that, I kind of wanted to make sure that we all understood those celebrations, the feasts. All right, if we look at the next verses 20 through 25 in Matthew chapter 26, we're going to see kind of a little theme here. These verses are about identifying the Lord's betrayer. Is it I, right? Now, we know who it is. When Jesus talks about this, we know who it is, but the disciples did not. We're not sure exactly how many of them really understood what was unfolding, what was happening there at the table. We certainly know that some of them did not hear or understand what was happening, or they would have probably piled on Judas and beat him pretty severely. But we're going to be looking at this a little differently, because John actually has most of the detail of this. So we'll look at like Matthew and Mark and Luke, and then we'll look at John, who has the most detail at the end. We may come back to Matthew for just a little summary, but really a lot of that will focus on what's in John. So, all right, so let's look at our verses here. It's Matthew chapter 26, verses 20 through 25. When evening had come, he sat down with the 12. Notice, it says sat down. They actually reclined at table is what it really says. He sat down with the 12. Now, as they were eating, he said, "Assuredly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." And they were exceedingly sorrowful, and each of them began to say to him, "Lord, is it I?" Now, we have to understand, it says evening had come, the sun has set. The sun has set, and now, by their standards, the way they do their time and their days, this is now Passover. So even though verse 17 says on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it is the Passover day. So from our study, we know that they meant Passover, as we're told back in Leviticus as we looked at. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Does anybody have anything they want to mention or talk about before we end class? All right. Okay, so thank you for your time and attention this morning. Lord willing, we will pick up here next week.